Charles Waldheim, architect professor at GSD, will make a presentation. And as we can see, the title, Notes on French Landscape Urbanism. Charles is a North American architect and urbanist based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Charles, yes, thank you. You're already here. Very nice. Waldheim's research examined the relationship between landscape, ecology, and contemporary urbanism. On these topics, Waldheim is author, editor, and co-editor of numbers of publications on this topic, including landscape as urbanism. Yes, you coined this wording back in '97, if I'm correct. But you will tell us more about this. I think we had here an example of one of the French landscape urbanist designers. Please.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, IFLA, 1,400 of us. It's nice to see you all here. I was about to vote for more Elissa Cassini violin solo personally, but thanks to Bruno Marquez, Henri Bavard, the organizers here, IFLA, the French Federation, and on the ground in Nantes. Congratulations, Gunther, well deserved. I've been invited to say a little bit about the relationship between French landscape practice and the emergence of the Anglophone ideas and practices around landscape urbanism over the past decades. I think the impetus behind this is not just to return to history, but in fact to elucidate something that Karen mentioned about theory following practice. She's exactly right about this, that change happens in practice as practice meets novel conditions in the world. New modes of practice emerge, new professions form, new identities are shaped. And the role of theory or history is to step back from that, to reflect, to provide a kind of lens as to what's happening, to be able to describe it. And so my comments, brief as they are, will follow two trajectories. One from practice in France to Anglophone theory, and then back to France. And then secondly, the migration of ideas between the English-speaking world and the French-speaking world. And I'll end with a couple of notes about nomenclature. So let's not look at me. Let's return here. Well, the English language discourse on landscape urbanism emerged in the late 1990s and the early aughts. It did little to acknowledge its indebtedness to French contributions. Landscape urbanism was first launched in a conference in Chicago sponsored by the Graham Foundation. It featured a dozen speakers from the US, Canada, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Spain, none from France. And the eponymous exhibition that followed it the next year was similar. Despite this, French thinkers were quite influential at the emergence of these ideas, most notably Christophe Giraud and Sébastien Marot, among others, who began immediately to inform the new program at the Architectural Association in London and my own program in Chicago. And at the same moment, there were French landscape architects on our minds, especially the work of Michel Devine, Christine Delgnocchi, Alexander Chemetov, among others. In that context, Chemetov, Devine, and Marot became important interlocutors both in Europe and in North America in the emergence of the discourse in English around landscape urbanism. Both the AA publication and my own 2006 Landscape Urbanism Reader featured chapters by French authors as well as a chapter by Kelly Shannon on European antecedents. And Kelly did a very good job of highlighting the work of Dominique Perrault, Agence Terre, Michel Devine, and a range of others. Now, of course, we were aware in the US and in the UK of the foundational work of Courrejoud. And from our point of view, retrospectively now, looking back at the kind of the enormous influence of Courrejoud, what I would say is that he was perceived by us in the Anglo world as being quite foundational to the recovery of landscape architecture as a cultural project and certainly as a form of practice. And at the same moment, he was not at least received or perceived as an urbanist in the conversations that we were having. In 2006, the French geographer and agronomist Pierre Donadieu authored an article in the Journal of Landscape Architecture on landscape urbanism in Europe. And in this, he quite rightly argued that the partly describe the professional practices of landscape architecture emerging in France in the 1970s. So I'm showing you here Jacques Sgard's Parc André Malraux from La Défense in the 1970s. Donadou's thesis was that, in fact, that these French practices combining landscape architecture and urbanism anticipated our interest in the topic, of course, and that also explained why the French didn't really invite us, because it was not such big news, right? Like, the French had been doing this for a very, very long time. Maybe interestingly, Donadou also acknowledged the historic role of the French tradition of the grand projet, right? We don't talk about grand projet in the same way these days, but Donadou did a very nice, now 20 years ago, survey of Mitterrand's grand projet and the role of landscape for international audiences. I'm not here to open old wounds, but it is true that both the Bernard Tschumi winning scheme for the 1982 La Villette competition, as well as the Rem Koolhaas OMA second prize, neither of those were authored by French designers. Having said that, it was in fact the French competition structure, right, the conveyance of large public projects, inviting new ideas, the audacity of those ideas that really came to the fore. In particular, ideas of open-endedness and indeterminacy, the notion of an open work that certainly Chimatov had been thinking about, that both Tschumi and Koolhaas respond to. And of course, Koolhaas OMA continued to develop these ideas in the 1987 response to the Milan Sonart competition. So the French contribution transcends not just practice or theory, but in fact goes to state formation and the notion of the construction of projects through commissions, competitions, and the like. By the early 1990s or mid-1990s, in the formation of this concept, there was a legible body of work by French landscape architects available as precedent that we were quite aware of. These included, of course, the André Citroën Park by Provost and Clement, among others, that is quite familiar to this audience. And maybe even more obscurely back then was this notion of the Coulée Verte René Dumont by Virgile and Mathieu. Of course, now we can see retrospectively a fundamental, important, foundational precedent for landscape urbanist ideas avant les lettres. But among others, it would probably be fair to say, at least for my own thinking in the aughts, there was probably no other more influential French thinker than Alexander Chimatov. Chimatov's been invoked many times because of his work on the Plan Guide here on the Ile de Nantes. But before that, Chimatov's advocacy for a kind of openness, a kind of relational urbanity, that comes to be embodied in his work here, and this notion of the kind of work of planning as something that avoids the master plan. The idea of open-ended revisions to propositional plans going forward, and almost a kind of empirical observation, like a real-time response to what's going on in relationship. And I think Jacqueline Ostia, of course, said this as well in her relationship to the Ile de Nantes. It's in that context that for Anglo audiences around the world, and for me personally, Chimatov's notion of a kind of populist democratic uprising through kind of relational non-planning was quite both avant-garde in a way. More recently, his work on the Le Plateau d'Aille in Nancy, which he describes as a dépaysement. I'm told this translates literally to something like a change of scenery, but I read also as a kind of response to large state planning projects, right? It's a kind of after the failure of modernism, a response to the intervention through landscape in these kinds of contexts. So now for a brief historical detour. We'll go back to the 19th century. This is the business card of one Humphrey Repton. Humphrey Repton was one of those nascent professionals that was beginning to be hired so as to reorganize the estates of the landed gentry and the elites in the United Kingdom and in Great Britain, in England in particular. Repton chose the professional identity of landscape gardener. He did so very consciously, and he did so to great effect. And of course, I'm interested here in the origin of the formulation of landscape architect, right? No less a figure than Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe in 1961, having stepped down as founding president of this body, said that the landscape architect is surely wrongly named. Frederick Law Olmsted, right, the American founder, decried the miserable nomenclature of landscape. He preferred the French terms overwhelmingly. We seem as a profession, as a discipline, to have been in a way kind of haunted for a very long time about nomenclature. And I think on behalf of my own advocacy here, but also on behalf of the organizers, I'm hopeful that we can use the 61st anniversary of this august body to put that nomenclature anxiety to rest. I don't think there's any question about the origin of the field, and it stems from here, not from us. Now, I'm showing you an image of the so-called Central Park in New York, and what I want to share with you is that in its formulation, The Central Park was meant to be a mid-19th century remedy to the rapid urbanization going on up the island of Manhattan. I'm showing you here Frederick Olmsted in 1850. By the end of that decade, of course, he had become the superintendent at a very tender age of this nascent Central Park. Now, superintendent was a civil service job. He had no background in design, never trained, never practiced as a designer, but by the mid to late 50s, he was kind of running short of cash. He had tried farming, that didn't work out. He sort of failed at publishing. He had been a journalist of note, abdicating for a range of social conditions. At the same moment, he was encouraged by a family friend to take up this job as civil servant as the superintendent, quote unquote, of the new Central Park. He did so very nimbly and very quickly advocated internally for the holding of a public design competition. He then partnered with the best available architect, Calvert Vaux, who was actually an architect. And of course, Olmsted and Vaux won the design competition by a strictly party line vote. The 9 jury members were 5 Republican farmers representing Albany in the state of New York and 4, Tammany Hall Democrat machine operatives. So I don't mean in any way to diminish that history. What I want to suggest is, first of all, conflict of interest. I don't know where we are on that subject today. He was a nimble operator. And what I want to share with you is that in all of that work, all the way through 1859 and the beginning of the construction of the Central Park, Olmsted consistently and explicitly referred to himself as an architect, full stop. That might have been puzzling to Calvert Vaux, who had actually experienced and trained as an architect. But in fact, after winning the competition, Olmsted promoted himself titularly to architect-in-chief. Curious, yeah? You can see here the watercolor drawings in the original competition entry by Vaux and team. Now, by the winter of 1858, early 1859, Olmsted had expended his budget. He had kind of had a nervous breakdown, and his board put him on a little bit of a timeout, and they sent him to Europe. So he took this famous 1859 tour of the great parks, beginning in the United Kingdom and through Europe. And in November of 1859, he spent 2 weeks in Paris, where he visited the Bois de Boulogne no fewer than 7 times. At the Bois de Boulogne, right, the royal hunting ground that was being reconfigured as a part of the kind of infrastructural reworking of the city, he encountered Adolphe Alphonse, and he encountered drawings that had been stamped Service de l'architecte-paysagiste. From that moment on, from November of 1859 until his return to New York in 1860, Olmsted invited himself to use the English translation landscape architect based on that precedent. Now, of course, it wasn't Alphonse that used that formulation first. The attribution is attributed to the famous French architect, engineer, gardener, Jean-Marie Morel. At the beginning of the 19th century, Morel had been trained at the École de Pont et Chaussée. He was doing work that was a kind of hybrid between different practices. And so his obituary, when he died, included the hyphenated architect-paysagiste. And this became national news, given his stature. And it was that service of the architect-paysagiste that Olmsted used as the definition of his new profession. So what I want to share with you is not to just throw flowers on the Francophone origins of the field and to say that we have a perfectly good title in architect-paysagiste or landscape architect. What I want to say is that the first commission in the world, in English, for a landscape architect was not for the design of a park, a promenade, or a pleasure ground. It was for the design of the shape of the city, full stop. This is the commission that Olmsted and Vaux won in the spring of 1860. It's for the planning of northern Manhattan above 155th Street, above Washington Heights, where the topography was so extreme that it wasn't understood that a regular urban grid would be repeated. Now, in that competition and their subsequent project for the planning of northern Manhattan, Olmsted consolidated that identity and then retroactively applied it to every subsequent park, beginning with Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and then historically to advocate for the formulation of this new field. Beyond the professional title, Olmsted also longed for specific English translations of the French terms and practices that he felt more adequately captured the subtleties of this new art. Since the turn of this most recent century, of course, French designers have developed a range of project types that embody many of landscape urbanism's aspirations. As I've suggested, those were already nascent. They were already happening here in a way that the French practices didn't really need a theory of landscape urbanism. The Anglophone world, I believe, needed it. That's why it flourished. But they're also changing their status in relationship to their relationship to urbanism, to planning, and to engineering, and to architecture. And as they do, they're incorporating more sophisticated scientific knowledge and techniques. We've seen some of that already this afternoon. To take one typological example that Jacqueline mentioned, of course, the restructuring of urban waterfronts and the restructuring of post-industrial sites is really, an extraordinarily strong portfolio of work, and there are many, many examples that one could see. But of course, Henri Bava et Jean Stairs' Parc de Doc on Saint-Ouen would be by now canonical in this regard. At the same moment, there have been a number of French landscape practices working on riverfronts. I'll show you here Devine's work at the Lyon Confluence 1 and 2, which is, I don't know how it's received here, but as a project underway, has been quite influential in my circles in terms of the notion of the density of planting and the notion of, as we've seen in previous projects, both in the work of Osti, but also in the work of Chimatov, the idea of a long duration non-plan, a kind of structure that will endure long enough in the public imaginary. Similarly, Devine's, Parc aux Angéliques in Bordeaux has been quite significant, quite influential for thinking in our parts of the world. Many, many emergent French practices are worthy of this. Jacqueline just mentioned she's been doing this for 40 years, thank you, and she has projects going through 2040. So this is a different kind of work at a different scale. I won't say more than she has about her Martin Luther King Park, but I do want to suggest that what I am here to suggest is the international reception of these projects has been quite significant, right? So it's not just a conversation within France, but in fact, the diaspora of these projects as they surface reveal the elevated status, the renewed role of the landscape architect in this mantle. And similarly, of course, their work on the Écoquartier, Flaubert, and Rouen is quite seminal. While at a different stage of development and a work very much in progress, I think these projects indicate quite a flourishing and vibrant conversation about the role of the landscape architect going forward. Ultimately, of course, we could also talk about a range of urban projects looking at the restructuring of the contemporary city, the periphery of the city. We've also heard a lot more about the idea of technology and the economy and campus clusters. Among many, many projects that I could share with you in my brief remarks, the Paris-Saclay cluster and Devine's approach to this maybe exemplifies, again, for international audiences, a certain kind of aspiration for the landscape urbanist agenda, the notion of the landscape architect, like Olmsted, like Alphonse, having responsibility not just for the decorative, not just for the ecological, not just for the plant material, but in fact for the infrastructure, for the shape of the city itself. These kinds of projects for me today, many of them French, indicate the salience of the landscape architect as the urbanist for our age. Thank you.